In one of the historical notes in H.B. Lyle's latest novel, Spy Hunter, he tells us, "It has always been assumed that Sherlock Holmes enjoyed a long, peaceful retirement in Sussex. This assumption stems partly from Dr. Watson's story, His Last Bow. Published in 1917, it tells the story of how Sherlock Holmes had assumed the character of an Irish Republican, Altamont, how he'd set this up by going to America for 2 years, and how, ultimately, he bested the German super spy von Bork. It is clear that Watson took Wiggins's advice and created an alternative, more fitting legacy for his great friend. It may not be factually correct, but who can grudge the good doctor his one deviation from historical accuracy?" H.B. Lyle joins us to discuss this and more in this episode of I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere. Support for I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere comes from MX Publishing, with the largest catalog of new Sherlock Holmes books in the world. New novels, biographies, graphic novels, and short story collections about Sherlock Holmes. Find them at mxpublishing.com.
And listeners like you who support us on Patreon or Substack, sign up for exclusive benefits at patreon.com/ihearofsherlock or ihearofsherlock.substack.com.
I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, episode 296, Spy Hunter.
I hear of Sherlock everywhere since you became stronger.
In a world where it's always 1895, it's I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, a podcast for devotees of Mr. Sherlock Holmes, the world's first unofficial consulting detective.
I've heard of you before. You're Holmes the meddler, Holmes the busybody, Holmes the Scotland Yard Jack in office.
The game's afoot as we interview authors, editors, creators, and other prominent Sherlockians on various aspects of the great detective in popular culture.
As we go to press, sensational developments have been reported.
So join your hosts, Scott Monty and Bert Wolder, as they talk about what's new in the world of Sherlock Holmes.
You couldn't have come at a better time!
I'm Bill Curtis. This is I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere. Now, here are your hosts, Scott Monty and Bert Walder.
Oh, hello and welcome to I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, the first podcast for Sherlock Holmes devotees where it's always 1895. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Bert Wolder.
Bert, I've been spying on you.
Oh, I wondered who drilled that hole in the wall. Well, thank goodness it's just you.
Since it was 3 feet wide, I was hoping you wouldn't notice. But...
Well, you can't put anything over on me.
No. Well, we got a lovely interview today with H.B. Lyle, known to himself as Ben. We'll be talking with him about his Baker Street Irregulars series, particularly the most recent one, Spy Hunter. And it's interesting because this lands us in a World War II setting, which is appropriate since we just had an interview a couple of episodes ago with Nicholas Meyer about Telegram from Hell. So there seems to be a lot of convergence of interest of Sherlock Holmes in the World War I. Excuse me, did I say World War II? I meant World War I settings. So there we go. Well, just a reminder before we hop into things, because we've got the news ahead. We've got Madeline Quinones' A Chance of Listening. And, of course, we've got the Canonical Couplet, where you see who won a prize from the last episode, and you get a chance to win a prize for this episode. Did want to remind folks that you can support the show on Patreon or Substack, whichever works for you. We have links in the show notes. For as little as $1 a month, you can help us do what we do here, and it defrays the cost of hosting and the technology we use and all of the bells and whistles that go into making a podcast. You don't need to know the details, but you do need to know that any contribution amount helps us do what we do in keeping alive the memory of Sherlock Holmes and sharing with you what's going on in the world of Sherlock Holmes. So make sure you check a link there at patreon.com/ihearofsherlock or ihearofsherlock.substack.com. Well, that very official music means it's time for the news. We open the news bag, Bert, and see what kind of stories we have this time around.
Well, yes, and there are a bunch of entertainment stories. You know, if you look at what's going on in the news and you see the number of theatrical productions around the country in the United States that involve Sherlock Holmes, the things going on in local theater with plays by Ken Ludwig and other people popping up here and there, it's such a volume that I think it probably exceeds our ability to report it. But also television. This has the outline of perhaps being another age of increased enthusiasm for Sherlock Holmes, because there are a couple of series that are in production, and we've got some updates on them. There's on the CW, Sherlock and Daughter is on the horizon. And that series, which will be on HBO, is set a premiere date. It's and in addition to the cast, several additions to the cast, the series apparently follows a Sherlock Holmes who's out of his comfort zone. The renowned sleuth finds himself mysteriously unable to investigate a sinister case without risking the lives of his closest friends. And there's an American, Amelia, who learns her missing father may be the esteemed detective after her mother's shocking and inexplicable murder. And so we've got a number of people who've joined that cast. And I guess that's going to be on Oh, no, something else is on HBO, not that. That's the CW's Sherlock and Daughter.
Right.
And then there's a couple other developments too. There is Guy Ritchie's Young Sherlock Holmes, which announced the cast of Mycroft Holmes. And I think, haven't we talked about that before? I know we've talked about the series.
We talked about the series, but I don't think we talked about who would be cast as Mycroft.
Oh, that's right. That's the news. And it's an actor named Max Irons who will take the role of Mycroft, the elder son, who will play Mycroft alongside of the actor who's playing Sherlock.
Max Irons, is he by any chance Jeremy Irons' son?
Well, could be.
But he is.
Oh.
Jeremy Irons and Sinead Cusack.
Oh, fabulous. That's right. Interesting.
Family of... It comes from a family of acting. So that's good news. Should be interesting to see how this plays out with a young Mycroft.
Yeah.
And also connected to the entertainment world, Crime Reads has a feature by none other than Steve Doyle from Wessex Press and the Baker Street Irregulars. You've heard Steve here before. Steve has a piece called Bringing Nicholas Myers, the 7% Solution to the Big Screen. And it's a really nice essay that talks about the entire development of the book and how it turned into the movie. And there's actually a wonderful story in there about the casting of Robert Duvall as Watson. And as I looked at the transcript for that, it was actually lifted directly from our interview with Nicholas Meyer in episode 85. That was the very story he told to us in that 2-hour mega episode, which has a lot of this information as well. So you might want to check that out. We'll also put a link in the show notes, not only to all of these stories, but to episode 85 with Nicholas Meyer, because that was, I listened to that in preparation for our Telegram from Hell interview, and he's just such a great storyteller. Going back to that and revisiting it was just wonderful and refreshing.
Yeah, it was great to find that on Crime Reads, and that entire piece which is worth looking at because now you folks can see this online at Crime Reads, is excerpted from the Baker Street Journal's Christmas Annual in 2015, which was called Together Again for the First Time, 40 Years of the 7% Solution. So if you don't have that Christmas Annual, you can now read this huge excerpt from that publication and learn all about how the 7% solution came to be. And then in the Telegraph in Britain, they published a fascinating article by Jake Carriage on the 26th of September, The 10 Best Sherlock Holmes Pastiches and Some to Avoid. And interestingly enough, although this says it's the 10 best Sherlock Holmes pastiches, it's a mix of books and films and other things, and there are not 10 of them, there are 15 of them actually. But at the bottom of the list is Murder, but still good, Murder by Decree from 1979 with Christopher Plummer. Number 14, The House of Silk. The Return of Sherlock Holmes, number 13, 1987. Sherlock Holmes Game of Shadows, number 12. The Victorian Undead comic book, number 11. Mr. Holmes, the film. Bill Condon's film with Ian McKellen, number 10. Number 9, The Exploits of Sherlock Holmes. Young Sherlock Holmes, number 8. The Sherlock TV series, number 7. Dead Man's Land, a novel of 2013. Sherlock Holmes and the Voice of Terror, there's a surprise, number 5 from 1942 with Basil Rathbone. The Elementary TV series, number 4. 7% Solution, number 3. The Further Adventures of Sherlock Holmes on the Radio, BBC, number 2. And number 1, The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes, 1970. And you will not be surprised to find that topping the list of the 5 to avoid is Holmes and Watson with Will Ferrell and John C. Reilly.
Well, let's not stop there. Let's also include the horrific Hound of the Baskervilles from 1978 with Peter Cook and Dudley Moore. And the last Sherlock Holmes novel by Michael Dibdin. Sherlock Holmes in the Case of the Silk Stocking from TV. Rupert Everett was Holmes there. And
Sherlock Holmes in New York.
That's the one. Sherlock Holmes in New York.
Poor Roger Moore.
I know. Well, it's an interesting list, and I'm sure you can add your own to that list as well, favorites and unfavorites. I know there's a cult following for Holmes and Watson out there. I don't necessarily understand it myself, but hey, have fun with it, right?
Yeah, it's all comedy.
And we should also note that 221 BCon is open. Registration is open to attend the Fan Con for all things Sherlock Holmes in Atlanta from April 11th through 13th, 2025. So you can check that out at 221bcon.com.
Are we going?
It's going to be a busy spring. I can't see myself getting down to Atlanta unless I'm there for another reason this time around.
Tough. Never been.
One of these years.
Yeah. And then last, I mentioned the productions of all these things, including the series Young Sherlock. Interestingly enough, online, they've published just this month. They are still in production of that show, and they published 17 behind-the-scenes photos. So if you're interested in what the production looks like and some shots of the actors who you will eventually see in Young Sherlock, you can find that online, and we will have a link to that in the show notes. It was from a local paper in Bristol in England.
And just late breaking news here as we wrap up. Dame Maggie Smith has died. She was 89 years old, and the connection to Sherlock Holmes, there's a few, actually. One, she played Dora Charleston as in Murder by Death, a Neil Simon spoof. She and David Niven were the Nick and Nora type couple. And, of course, Holmes and Watson made an appearance, but were later cut out because the actors felt that they were upstaged by this last-minute appearance of Holmes and Watson. You can still find clips occasionally of them motoring up to the mansion in their Model T. And let's see, she was also Lady Blueberry in Sherlock Gnomes, for those of you who enjoy the animated stylings. And finally, she was married to Robert Stevens from 1967 through 1975. And that would have been the exact time when Robert Stevens was portraying Sherlock Holmes in The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes. So we raise a glass of Highclere Castle gin in the direction of the Dowager Countess and the late, great Maggie Smith. And that's all the news that fits in this episode. We'll be sure to bring you up to speed on all the Sherlockian news we can find that's relevant and interesting next time. Autumn is here, and with it is an opportunity to revisit some of the books presented at MX Publishing. You'll recall in recent months we've interviewed such authors as Tracy Revels and Christopher Chan. Well, their books are available in the weeks and months ahead on MX Publishing. In addition, you'll be able to check out other pastiches and even a Sherlock Holmes book of puzzles called Shertle. There are audiobooks galore, and of course, don't forget about the MX book of new Sherlock Holmes stories, as David Markham continues his literary editing tour de force in crafting and curating and selecting Sherlock Holmes pastiches from canonically appropriate eras. No matter what your interest is, MX Publishing has something related to it as regards to Sherlock Holmes. And don't forget, every time you buy a book or another publication on the MX Publishing site, MX Publishing will share a meal through the World Food Program, a project that has passed 200 million meals shared worldwide. So find what matters to you and do some social good at the same time at mxpublishing.com. After a career in feature film development, H.B. Lyle took an M.A. in creative writing, followed by a Ph.D. at the University of East Anglia, an experience which led to the creation of The Irregular, a different class of spy. This novel, featuring Wiggins as an adult, was set in 1909 and tracked the beginnings of the British Secret Service. The Irregular series continued with The Red Ribbon and The Year of the Gun, set in 1912. His latest novel featuring Wiggins is Spy Hunter, and it takes us to 1914 and the lead up to World War I. H.B. Lyle lives in South London with his partner and their twin daughters. He also writes screenplays and tries weekly to give up Twitter. Ben Lyle, welcome to I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere.
Thank you. I'm incredibly excited and happy to be here.
Well, we are excited to be talking with you. We actually recently had a conversation with Nicholas Meyer, who you may know from the 7% Solution. His latest book is actually an interesting intersection in timelines with your own book. His is The Telegram from Hell, and it takes place on the brink of World War I. And I think that's where we're going to find ourselves with you today. Before we do get to that, we want to ask you, where and how did you first meet Sherlock Holmes?
Yes, I thought you were going to ask me that because obviously, you know, your stupendous podcast is all about him. My elder brother, who's 3 years older than me, was a big Sherlock Holmes fan before I was first. And he got the Baring Gould annotated edition. He got my mum to make him a sort of ankle-length camel hair dressing gown in the style of the Sidney Paget illustrations, you know, the best illustrations in many ways. And so he was totally into it. And then at the age of about 10, I can't remember exactly, about that age, the peerless ITV productions, the Jeremy Brett productions on Granada Television of the Sherlock Holmes adaptations started. And they were like the best thing on television when I was 10 or 11, and I used to stay up to watch them. So that was probably the whole Holmes thing was firmly established in my family, and then they came on, and I'm sure you'll agree that they're among the best adaptations on the screen that we've ever had.
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely.
So what did you think? What do you remember about reading, your first Sherlock Holmes story? Were you a fan of other things that fiction of that? Were you a big detective story reader?
I didn't read much till I was about 13, and then I started reading loads. And so, yes, I read a bit of Agatha Christie. I mean, my favourite book as a teenager was actually the Flashman books by George MacDonald Fraser.
Oh, yeah.
Which that was the thing that got me into reading properly. And then obviously you read all the Holmes things. And actually we used to have, they're incredibly prevalent now, audiobooks, but my brother and I used to have tapes of quite a few tapes of audiobooks. And I used to listen to them going to sleep. And we had a few brilliant Holmes things there, a particularly good one of The Sign of the Four, and another good one read by Robert Hardy, a few sets of the short stories.
Love those.
Again, brilliant adaptation. So it was sort of through various media, what passed for multimedia in the 1980s, that I experienced that. And sort of Agatha Christie and various detective fiction, but I wasn't a particular aficionado, I would say, of detective fiction other than Holmes, because although he's kind of the first in lots of ways, is quite different from all that 1920s and 1930s golden age stuff.
Yeah, really is. But with that sort of reading approach, and obviously you must have gotten, when did you get into thrillers and things like that? When did you first read Le Carré, as an example?
Well, probably not until much later. So that would be, I had a job that I still do occasionally for a film company in London from about 20, 25 years ago. I started working for them, where I used to read books to see if they should be films or whether to put resource into making them films. And that meant I read incredibly eclectically because I was paid to read. So whatever came through the door, as was then, now on email. So I've read one or two books of like loads of authors. And then I probably got into Le Carré maybe about 15, 20 years ago, more. And then I did some work on the Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy script, that was the Gary Oldman one. Just a little bit of development work on that. And that was also, but my reading was more based either of the film work and screenplays, or much more sort of literary, for want of a better word, the Booker Prize winners, whatever's going on there. Because I did an MA, what you guys would call an MFA in creative writing at University of East Anglia. And that's all sort of literary writing, literary novels and all that kind of stuff. And so I wasn't particularly planning to be a thriller writer or a detective writer until I had the idea for the Irregular.
Yeah.
So
tell us a little bit about the idea of the Irregular.
I'm just looking to see if I've got the book somewhere. It's a constant companion to me, but I was doing this particular book. Here it is. So for your listeners, it's MI6, The History of the Secret Intelligence Service, 1909 to 1949. Now, that book came out when I was doing my MA. It came out at the 100th anniversary of the official Secret Service. And it was set up in 1909. And that was when I had the idea. I was like, oh, wow. I had the idea, what if you put in the same way that George MacDonald Fraser takes Flashman out of Tom Brown's School Days and classic Victorian literature and put him into real history. What if you did that for Wiggins and the start of the Secret Service? So that was the idea that came all together. And I didn't conceive it particularly as a genre piece or this or that or the other. I just thought that's a really fun idea to tell that story. And it has all the things I'm interested in, Secret Service, and it has a lot of the class dynamic, which is one of the interesting things to me about the Irregular, that doesn't appear as much in spy fiction and also doesn't appear much, Holmes and Watson are very much gentlemen. They're not aristocracy, but they're certainly not working class. Right. And that was where it all started, really. So it was kind of like a random idea based on what I used to love reading as a teenager in a strange way.
Well, that works extraordinarily well, because when you consider the original Baker Street Irregulars, which, by the way, and you probably know this, in World War II, Churchill referred to a group of spies as the Baker Street Irregulars. But when you think about the original Irregulars that Holmes hired help for seeing things that he couldn't see, going out and being a distributed network, basically, of spies. That's what he used them for in the original stories.
Exactly. That was their main job, really, was following people and being tails and, watching people. And they're only in 2 stories, really. Well, they're in a third one as well. But yes, I know about that. The Department of Ungentlemanly Warfare, it was also called, because in Churchill called them the Irregulars because their original headquarters was in Baker Street. So, but yes, I didn't really think of it in that way. We get in the Sign of the Four. They're sent to look for something, aren't they? Yeah. And it's the same as in the Study in Scarlet as well. They're out there. I can't remember the exact quote. They can go everywhere, see everything, and not be seen.
Exactly. Yeah, and Bert and I are both members of the literary society, the Baker Street Irregulars, and when we are granted our irregular shilling, that's the official recognition that you've become a member, we get a certificate, and it says, having passed all the prescribed tests, blah, 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 the name of the invested is hereby authorized in the pursuit of the Sherlockian world to go everywhere, see everything, and overhear everyone.
Okay, fantastic. Yeah. The shilling for the boy who finds the boat, isn't it? The Aurora.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's exactly it. So talk to us about how you developed Wiggins as this standalone. What kind of other than what we know about the character, what kind of a backstory did you give him, and how did you develop that into his own thing?
Well, so that came. So obviously, what came first is the idea to have him. So I kind of fudged his age a bit, but to have him about this age. So I had to account for, at least 10 years of adult life to make it fit with the Holmes canon. And I kind of used real history, as you know, in the books. And I wanted to use the Doyle's canon as if it were real history as well. So rather than that being made up, that was real as well. And so, I had to give Wiggins a backstory to when we meet him in the Holmes stories, and then also had to fill in that gap of about 10 to 15 years in some way. And I suppose what I did there was I wanted to make him, to flesh out that idea of him being the perfect agent in a sense that all the sort of silver spoon public school boys could never be. So that involved illustrating his street smarts, growing up on the streets, how smart and clever that could make you. And then also you give him a stint in the army to show that he can fight as well. And the other reason for putting him in the army was it illustrates the point that's of Edwardian England that Wiggins, someone with Wiggins' birth and upbringing, is often never, despite the fact that he's often the smartest guy in the room, could never ascend the ladder of social mobility or economic mobility. So he could never have become, powerful and in charge in the army, even though he should have been. In the same way that same thing happens in the Secret Service. He's much cleverer than the boss, but he's never going to be the boss.
Well, we need him out there on the front lines doing what he does.
But, absolutely. I mean, it's obviously much more fun out there. But, there's a sort of massive glass ceiling there for someone like him.
Yeah.
And in the books as well, and for the women in the books too. And obviously, the books aren't about that, but, that's a sort of minor theme, I suppose.
So you began the series in 1909 with the origination of the Secret Service. And this is the Spy Hunter is now the fourth book in this series. And we find ourselves in 1914. And I don't think we're giving anything away because this is in the promotional material, but it says Sherlock Holmes has been murdered. So I'm curious, what we know about Sherlock Holmes' last case, chronologically speaking in the canon, is that it takes place with his last bow. And that is August of 1914. Holmes has just come off of some undercover work as a spy himself. Altamont, he'd gone over and joined the Irish Secret Society in Buffalo and done his undercover work with von Bork. Tell us a little bit about where Wiggins finds himself and Sherlock Holmes murdered. I can't even begin to grapple with that.
Well, I had the idea to murder Holmes a while ago because I hadn't really seen it done that often. And it's anyway, in various, I'm sure you guys have encountered it more than I have. But it's a natural progression for that hero to lose the mentor at some point. And there's a real conflict in Wiggins throughout most of the stories about whether he should be working for the government at all. And when we leave him before Spy Hunter in the third one, he's disillusioned with government work, as he sort of should be. But so one of the few things that will get him back is the death of Holmes. It's a sort of fantastic motivating force. And so Wiggins has left the Secret Service by the time this happens, because, he doesn't really want to be working for the powers that be, oppressing him and people like him. But the sort of twin motivators of the death of Holmes and the war sort of have to bring him back in. If you think about the longer arc of a hero like Wiggins, you do have to get rid of the mentor at some point. However fabulous they are as characters. And that is the first time in this story, actually, that I deviate from treating all of Conan Doyle's work as the truth. But I think I do account for it in the story. I think it makes sense that as part of the war effort, Watson would write a different ending for home stories than write down that he was murdered in such a way. So I don't know if it's a fudge. I think it made sense to me when I thought about it. Okay, this is the first time that Doyle's not true. But then The Last Bow is a very different kind of story, isn't it? From most of them. It's not Watson's first person either, is it? So that's, I sort of get out of it by saying that, oh, he penned this, but it's clearly not real. It's clearly a fiction.
Well, you know, the lovely thing about this series of books and about your idea, I mean, there's so many lovely things here. First of all, in your experience, being paid to be a reader at some point, you know, you get to acquire all of that sense of what works and what doesn't work in stories. I mean, it's like a separate MA in creative writing all by itself. But also you have the cinematic experience from working on scripts, so you know it's visual. And then, you know, your passion for history. And one of the nice comments about your books is the historical accuracy of that. But I'm curious, as you work with all of these parts, and you've got these other wonderful elements here about class, particularly in England, and these great moments in history. You know, this is when the world was changing. When you think about these stories or you begin to plot them out, have you come to any and we've just talked about a very different way of looking at Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes is a mentor. Have you come to any, what about the other historical characters? Have you come to think about them differently? Gotten any insights about some of these people, you know, who are setting up institutions like MI6, who are working in the government for reasons that they believe are really true? You know, the state of the empire at that time. I mean, that must have taken up some time of your thinking.
Yes. Yeah, I suppose it has. I mean, I would say I've always had a sort of rather revisionist view, I mean, of the Secret Service and the people who work in it, in the sense that although I love a lot of espionage fiction, I think a lot of the espionage industry likes to massively overplay its own importance. You know, it's like, it's always, oh, it's so serious. Yeah, the fate of the fate of countries, and you're like, really? And then you obviously that works in fiction. It has to, you know, there has to be stakes in fiction, right? It has to matter, and you read a lot of the stuff, like, as I said, these official histories, and they all bang about, you know, they all say how much it matters. This could have turned the progress of the war and all that. And then there's often not that much evidence for that when you read into it. Like most of these too, I've got the other official history here, the Defense of the Realm. This is the authorized history of MI5. And so much of it is about the scramble for resources, which you might read as like people justifying their jobs and maintaining, you know, their powerful positions, and these squabbles about, so much squabbling in the start of the Secret Service about who gets the credit for this and who gets paid for that, and what are who's my line manager and where does the money come from, and all this. And actually the sort of espionage successes, inverted commas, you do wonder how much difference they actually made, other than to help perpetuate the edifice of national security. Yeah. I mean, there's obviously a difference between wartime intelligence and peacetime intelligence. You know, like it's foolish to suggest that kind of stuff doesn't matter when you're literally fighting people. But a lot of the peacetime work, the people involved are flushed by a sense of their own importance, and also desperate to maintain their position and keep their job, you know, rather than being necessarily guided by sort of mission and, you know, vocation and passion. I mean, what I would also say, less so about MI6, but about MI5, is that early MI5 was also stuffed full of like proto-fascists, you know, literally, and they weren't interested in protecting democracy. They were interested in protecting the way things were for them and for the government. It's kind of like, you know, it's when you read it out loud and you realize quite how true that is, quite how ideological a lot of the service was. I think they're much less so now.
Yeah. That's See, but that's the heart. That must be at the heart of Wiggins' disillusionment with working for the government. That realization.
Oh, absolutely, and that's part. I mean, his main equivocation is he doesn't really want to be a spy. He doesn't want to work for a system that essentially suppresses him and people like him. It's grossly unfair, not just inside the country, but the empire also. So he doesn't really want to do that. Why would he do that sort of morally and intellectually? But on the other hand, he gets well paid. It's exciting, and he's really good at it, which it gives people a lot of satisfaction in their life. If you're really good at something. And so that's kind of his equivocation between the two. He's sort of built, born to do this kind of work. And he feels that, and it's more exciting than any other job he could do. And it's better paid, and he's got more agency and all these kind of things. So his moral qualms, he often gives into those. So in the books, he does give up on it, but various reasons. And, the death of Sherlock Holmes is like in the first book, he comes in because he needs to find something out. It's his friend. So he's got another reason to be part of the system. And the same with this fourth one. It's like, but that's always at play. Yeah. That, ambivalence about whether this is in any way a good thing.
By the way, we should tell our listeners, because you've just mentioned the first book, that there are 4 books, I think, right so far in this series, beginning with The Irregular in 2017, The Red Ribbon in 2018, The Year of the Gun in 2020, and now Spy Hunter in 2024. And can we presume that we're not done with Wiggins, that we may see him in future?
Well, hopefully. I haven't written book 5 yet. I've got an idea for book 5, because obviously there's a lot of action because the war's starting, So I've got an idea that I would like to do, but I haven't got around to doing it yet. And I've got an end point for Wiggins as well that I'd like to get to. One of the things I wanted to do with him that isn't the case in lots of series, which is fine as well, but is that he does move through time and through real events. So it's not like he's sort of held in aspect like Inspector Morse or Jeeves and Wooster, PG. It's not like it's always perpetually 1909. So, which means eventually he'll get too old, but the world will change, and etc., etc. So I know where I want to end it as well.
Well, this is interesting, because to me, I hear like Edwardian echoes of James Bond, and we obviously have, Mycroft is associated with the government. He is the government, as we've heard in a couple of the stories. We've got Wiggins now, who is doing his part. And there have been stories written where people have expostulated about the progeny of Sherlock Holmes or Mycroft. It goes off in terms of, maybe Nero Wolfe was the son of Mycroft. Maybe James Bond was the son of Sherlock Holmes and Irene Adler at one point. I mean, people are so fantastical in terms of their imagination. But do you see any of these stray threads being drawn together as you plot out the eventual future of Wiggins?
Only more as I like using things like that as sort of, I think people term them Easter eggs. So that kind of thing, a little bit of fun almost along the way. But temperamentally, I'm more interested in the sort of real events and I suppose I'm most interested in the thing that excites me most now is Wiggins and that character with that backstory in real things that happened. but that doesn't mean. So I'm more interested in him, for example, in book 4. He interacts a lot with Mata Hari, who's a real person that we know something about, but not loads about. And there's quite a few famous British authors who used to work for the Secret Intelligence Service, like in the war and just afterwards. So that would be a kind of interaction that would interest me more than interacting with other fictional characters, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
What about Conan? What about Conan Doyle? You know, has he ever crossed your thinking? Because before, you know, he was quite an advocate for the Channel Tunnel before there was a Channel Tunnel, because he was concerned about Britain being isolated in World War I and cut off from food supplies and things like that. And he was involved in the first life rafts for sailors and better helmets and armor for the military and things like that. I mean, have you found characters like that in your looking at these days, or have you thought about Conan Doyle as a character?
Yeah, I don't think I can go to Conan Doyle. I think he would be definitely to talk about what Scott said earlier about anything that's verboten, because because that would cut across the conceit that Holmes and Wiggins are real, I think. So, whereas I could do Rudyard Kipling, for example, who is a massive player like that, but I think my world is almost real, but with that conceit. But then if you bring Conan Doyle in, I mean, I could imagine doing that as a joke almost, just like someone in the background, you know, playing soccer in goal for Portsmouth, or, you know, whatever it is. As
an Easter egg.
A physical description. But to actually bring him in would be... that'd be like talking to breaking the fourth wall in a film or something.
Well, speaking about film, you know, one of the things this series cries out for is dramatization.
If only we knew someone who read for film companies.
Yeah, if only we knew someone who had that experience.
Well, I did write a screenplay with a great director called Saul Dibb. So there is a screenplay for this was a while ago. And they sort of went out. It didn't get commissioned, so we'll probably try again soon, because it's quite expensive to make. Obviously, you know, sort of action in Edwardian London, so it's sort of period and action and all that kind of stuff. But it probably needs, you know, the biggest star in the world or something to pick up the book and go, "Hey, this is amazing. I'd love to do it." Because you know, I mean, who knows how things are decided to get made or not, but so we'll see. That's still a plan, because obviously I agree with you that I would love to see it on the screen, because I do. It may not come across like this to the reader, but I do write in a visual way, in that I see the scene that I'm writing rather than just think it. So that's how my mind works. And it's like you said, but that job is an MFA in its own, really, of being forced to read and think about and summarize sort of 3 books a week,
right?
And with screenplays as well, and so you do learn a lot about how to tell stories, I think.
Well, I think the action and the scenes in Spy Hunter, and I haven't read the entire series, but the latest one is exciting. And for those who have interest in espionage fiction as well as detective fiction, who maybe happen to be Sherlockians as well, I mean, this just is right at the nexus of all of those. And Ben, as you picture in your mind these scenes, the characters, etc., and I'm kind of going more on the entertainment side now rather than the writer side. If you had to picture your ideal casting for Wiggins, who would step into that role?
That's a good question. Most of the people I think about now are too old but you want something with a bit of danger about them. Someone like Tom Hardy, maybe, but it's hard. I tell you, because it goes to that class thing. I would always want someone who to cast in that role to have come from a working class background, and there are fewer actors in Britain these days that have come from such a place. They so many of them have been to private school, etc., etc. Whereas there's that. So it's you could imagine a young Michael Caine. Michael Caine comes from a similar part of London from Wiggins. Could do it like that. So someone who's obviously smart and it's got that kind of native wit, for want of a better word. So I haven't actually had that. I'm terrible at casting, which is one of the most perhaps why it hasn't been made yet. But no, but yes, it would need to be someone that could handle that, because he's a sort of young man still in my mind, though. So most of the people, they become famous and they're like 30, 35, and you're like, it's that sort of working class intelligence and those street smarts that's the hardest thing to get, really.
Almost like a young Sean Bean, maybe.
Yes, except he's in my construction of him, he's very northern England, so he's sort of, that's his kind of thing. But yes, I mean, he did a great job in Sharp. Yeah, that's the yes, exactly right. You would, someone from that background who could then also do a London accent. Who else did we have? We were interested in Matt Smith. Could do that, I think. I can't remember. I would have liked, again, too old, Colin Farrell.
Oh, sure.
He's a sort of wiriness. But, my approach to casting is normally, well, who can finance it?
Yeah, right.
That's the ideal casting. Who gets it made?
Yeah. That's great.
Wow. Well, check out the entire Irregular series by H.B. Lyle. It's available, obviously, wherever you buy books, but we'll have links to all 4 in the series on the show notes on ihearofsherlock.com, as well as in the show notes on the podcast platform where you're listening right now. Ben, any last words of wisdom for us before we take our leave?
Well, I don't know if I even had any first words of wisdom.
You're perfect for the show. This is great.
Oh, yeah. You can be a co-host.
Okay, I'll tell you this. I don't know if any of your listeners are interested in being writers themselves or anything, but what I will say is that what I was interested in and what I read and what sparked my imagination, say between the ages of 15 and 25, has provided the vast amount of the material that I have to write about. Whether that's the interests or things you read or how you bounced off that. And the Irregular series is just a perfect example of that. It wasn't what I was studying when I was on my MFA. It wasn't something I had dreamed about, writing a thriller or anything like that. It came about from me being interested in the news and interested in what new books were coming about. And the fact that 2 of my favourite literary characters as growing up were Sherlock Holmes and Harry Flashman, and putting them together with an interest also in spy fiction, particularly spy films, that produced a whole series of books. And it was all something I was interested in, when I was about 17, 18. And even though that's a long time ago now, it's still be open to those things, because those things are in there in a way that maybe a lot of new information isn't in your head in the same way, or you don't feel it in the same way. So that would be my word of wisdom if you're sitting there thinking, oh, I'd like to write a story.
Well, I think that's just
great.
perfect.
That's great.
Well, Ben, thank you so much for spending some time with us here on I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere.
Thank you very much for having me. It's fantastic. And thank you for all your kind words about the book and about the writing and, putting it out there. I look forward to listening to myself back whenever it comes up.
It's interesting, isn't it? Of all the writers that we've talked to who are working in the world of mysteries and thrillers and Sherlock Holmes, how different and distinct each one is, from Nick Meyer to Michael Sims to so many of the others. And Ben Lyle, he gave us, I think, a master class in storytelling in some of our conversations with him. His focus on the audience, the fact that he was once paid to read, he's got this deep understanding of what readers expect. And his film experience, his focus on synopsis, reducing the plot of a thriller to just 2 pages. And the stories, he's done 4 novels over 6 years. He was inspired by George MacDonald Fraser, which immediately makes him very sympathetic to me, because many of us love those Flashman novels, and the historical accuracy he's imbued these works with. It's just I really enjoyed talking to him.
Yeah, it was a really wonderful surprise. And boy, if there was any job that I think any of us would want, screening novels for potential film projects, that might be a top 5. And it's interesting too, because you think about some of the conversations we've had in recent episodes with authors, playwrights, creators, etc. The sense of action and their ability to create something that brings the audience along with them, doesn't get mired in unnecessary details or subplots that are distracting. They really know how to drive a story, and I think we heard that in spades from Ben. The conversation kept going, and we have it as bonus content for our subscribers. We have a quick sample here. If you'd like to hear the entire thing, just sign up at patreon.com/ihearofsherlock or ihearofsherlock.substack.com.
The things that inspired you from 15 to 25, and that inspiration and hanging on to that when you think about stories, bringing new stories to life, is so great. What is your, I didn't ask you this because sometimes it gets tiresome when you ask writers this question, but generally at a high level, what is your process? I would imagine that you're pretty much a careful plotter, that you don't begin writing until you kind of know where you're going to end up.
I'm halfway in between that. So I quite like the first book's different. You have that. I like to know the ending, and not necessarily the exact ending, but the sort of the crucible of decision making and things that's going to happen at the end. But yeah, I like to do that. And the last couple of books and the other one, the last Spy Hunter, that was probably a maybe a 4-page synopsis. So one of the skills that I learned in my film career was being able to synopsize anything in like 1 to 2 pages, be it a script, a novel, whatever it is, a 2-page synopsis. So I actually work from about that, a bit longer, but then that changes. But I think the ending and the beginning are the 2 most important bits. So, and you can shift the middle quite a lot, so I don't write out a chapter plan, for example. It's not that detailed.
Do you think about a 3-act structure? Do you think about Act 1, Act 2, Act 3?
No. Now, even when I'm writing screenplays, I don't really do that. No, so I think about the opening and what people would, what film writing books call the inciting incident. What sets this story off? I think that's really important, because that is the story. You know, who's this about? What they're doing, and I think about what this writer, children's writer.
If you'd like to hear the rest of this bonus episode, please sign up with us as a supporter. It's A Chance of Listening with your correspondent, Madeline Quinones.
Hello, I'm Madeline Quinones, and today I'm here to talk about a delightful little podcast called This Tangled Skein, a monthly podcast about yarn, tea, and Sherlock Holmes, not necessarily in that order. Many of you will be familiar with Beth Gallego, the co-chair of the Sublibrarian Science Society and the webmistress of the John H. Watson Society. But did you know that Beth also ran a solo podcast for nearly a year? If podcasts were buildings, This Tangled Skein would be the quintessential cozy cottage. Beth talks about the tea that she's drinking, her current knitting projects, her most recent Sherlockian reads, which might include children's books, and Sherlockiana in general. Each episode is short, mostly under 20 minutes, which is a really smart move when you're podcasting alone. It's not exactly easy to be podcasting alone either. A podcast needs its host to be some combination of interesting, entertaining, and charming. You can't have a good podcast without those elements. And if you're the only host and the only voice on the show, it's really all down to you to make your show something worth listening to. And Beth nails it. Now, yes, she's a good friend of mine, but I swear I'm not biased. Rather, her authentic self just shines through in the podcasting medium. There's one other Sherlockian who has pulled off this solo trick, Matthias Bostrom, who we'll get to in a later segment. But clearly, Beth is in good company. Sadly, she only produced 10 episodes, but those 10 episodes are well worth the listen and easy to get through in under 5 hours. And that's it. That's all I've got for today.
Ah, that was a lovely recommendation.
Yes, yes.
And
now, you know, what Madeline said is that it's tough for a podcast to be effective without hosts that are charming, interesting, and intelligent. But I would presume our podcast is just as effective without that.
it's also longer.
Yeah, well, that's why.
And this is why we need to bring guests on.
Yeah,
Clearly.
exactly. Yeah.
That's great. Yeah, well, as Madeline was describing this tangled skein, and knitting was included in there, it made me recall some of the stories of the early days of Autumn in Baker Street, where our friend Bob
Tomlin.
Yes, Bob Tomlin, who was on episodes, I think, 10 and 11. Bob would host this at Bear Mountain, and in the audience, as people are listening to the talks, many of the Sherlockian women would be knitting. And I wondered what the connection was or is between knitting and Sherlockian interest in some of these women. And I've never seen any of the men knitting. That's a little odd. Well, maybe that's a yarn for another time.
Oh,
sorry. I had to. But Madeline did also mention there, as kind of a throwaway, Matthias Bostrom. Matthias recently gave the Baker Street Irregulars Trust annual lecture on Zoom, and I presume that will be available on YouTube at some point. But for those who attended, they were treated to a wonderful talk by Matthias about some of the early days of the Baker Street Irregulars and how the group was kind of publicized to the general public. So it should be interesting for folks to take a listen to.
Yeah, one of the things Matthias got into was the work of an irregular that you and I both revere, Charles Hans. And Matthias took us through the articles that required a great deal of research these were published in a variety of newspapers I think all in the 1940s in one way or another. And occasionally Hans would produce compilations of his work and make 100 copies of them and give them to people. And I wrote to Matthias after the lecture and asked if he would think about putting together a list of the dates and times of where those articles appeared so that some of us who want to spend some time pulling them up online could take a look at them. And I think he's working on that.
Oh, I'm glad you did that.
Yeah.
Oh, that's right. It's time for everyone's favorite Sherlock Holmes quiz program. It's Canonical Couplet, where we give you 2 lines of poetry, and we ask you to identify which Sherlock Holmes story it came from. Now, if you were around here last time, you may remember we gave you this clue. Peculiar troubles rock the empire's seat when Mycroft condescends to Baker Street. Okay, Bert, I'm going to give you the first crack at it.
Well, it's a terrific Baker Street-centered episode, and it was a wonderful case that began with a very obscure event, the theft of Mrs. Hudson's favorite cookware. It's the case that Watson called the Glorious Pot.
No, I'm sorry. No. I'm going to have to call you out on that one. No, we're going to go, as always, to our friend Eric Deckers, who came in with this. I believe I solved this one, which is good because I needed the win. It's the story of a young Mycroft Holmes who tries to change his image from an accomplished student into a rebellious teenager. Meanwhile, little brother Sherlock and his nerdy friends try to navigate life in a different social circle. It's the story Watson called The Freaks and Geeks Interpreter. Wait, that's not it, because Mycroft never rebelled against anything except a sensible diet. So it's more likely the Greek interpreter. Oh, Eric. I'm sorry, you are 0 for 2 in these last weeks. Our friend Dan Petty wrote in, and he actually nailed this. He said it's a 50-50 chance. My guess is The Adventure of the Bruce Partington Plans, unless Eric Deckers thinks it's the Greek interpreter. Nailed it, Dan. Yeah, that's right. It's the Bruce Partington Plans. Again, that clue was peculiar troubles rock the empire's seat. That, of course, was the missing plans for the Bruce Partington submarine, the empire's seat being rocked by those missing plans. Well, fortunately, we did have a number of people who did guess the Bruce Partington plans correctly, so we're going to bring out the prize wheel and give it a big spin as it slows down, landing on number 37, and that looks like it is Tim DeForest. Congratulations, Tim. What do we have for you? Oh, we have an item from our vault for you, so that is encouraging. Well, in this episode, we have a copy of one of Ben Lyle's books for you. We'll let the winner choose which book exactly they'd like, but we'll get that off to you if you are selected at random after having correctly answered this clue. No need of all that bother with the Kaiser had Lady Hilda been a trifle wiser. If you know the answer to this canonical couplet, put it in an email addressed to comment@ihearofsherlock.com with canonical couplet in the subject line. If you are among all of the correct answers and we choose your name at random, you'll win. Good luck. Well, we'll prepare ourselves for what comes next with that one.
Yeah. Very good.
Well, Bertram.
Yes.
I suppose we're at the end of our ropes here.
Hooray! I mean, aw.
Well, what do we have coming up next? Looks like another wonderful author conversation. Who will that author be? That's for us to know and for you to find out. Or not if you decide to unsubscribe. But don't do that.
Don't do that.
Subscribe, oversubscribe.
No, and give us a review for crying out loud.
Holy cow, that would be so wonderful.
Yeah.
I love seeing the feedback that we get from people about the shows. We had one in recently from Kim Gallegos or Gallego. Let me see what she had to say. Oh, she actually submitted a canonical couplet for the previous episode. She said, I really enjoyed your recent Trifles episodes, especially the one that you discussed David Stewart Davies in. I purchased Bending the Willow, but have not had time to read it. Seems like yesterday when the Granada series was shown on PBS, I would watch the shows with my college friends. So, and she concluded with, thank you very much for all that you do to create insightful, very entertaining shows. You've brought a lot of joy into my life, and I really appreciate you both. Your shows are the best podcasts available.
Oh, that's great.
Well, Kim Gallegos, you need to get out and listen to more podcasts, clearly. Well, we sincerely appreciate that. And if you can tell other people your sentiments about the show in a rating or review, we would definitely appreciate it. You can do that on Apple Podcasts or Spotify.
Yeah. Thank you in advance.
Indeed. TIA. Well, this is the always advancing Scott Monty.
And I'm perpetually behind the 8-ball, Bert Walder.
And get your cue balls out, because this is the time when we say the games of foot.
The games of foot.
You know, I'm afraid that in the pleasure of this conversation, I'm neglecting business of importance, which awaits me elsewhere.
Thank you for listening. Please be sure to join us again for the next episode of I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, the first podcast dedicated to Sherlock Holmes.
Goodbye, and good luck, and believe me to be, my dear fellow, very sincerely yours, Sherlock Holmes.